Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you the latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. With the season progressing, the focus on many farms switches towards parasite control in lambs. One of the first challenges they'll face is that of Nematodirus. To explain the condition further, we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Orla Keane. Orla's going to explain the disease, how it impacts the lamb, what signs we need to look out for, and how we go about treating the condition. Orla, thanks very much for coming back to join us on OviCast.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much, Kieran.
I suppose in the early part of the grazing season, we focus primarily on two of the main parasites that can affect young lambs. That's coccidiosis and nematodirus. We're coming to a time of the year now where nematodirus becomes an issue again. Maybe if you had an opportunity first, you'll explain how the condition affects lambs and what the disease is.
So nematodirus is a disease of young lambs. So, it usually affects lambs from about 6 to 12 weeks of age. And it's caused by an intestinal worm. But this particular nematodirus worm has a different life cycle than the mid-season stomach and gut worms that you see later on. So for nematodirus, the eggs require a long period of cold weather, followed by a period of warmer weather above 10 degrees in order to hatch. So what you find is that the nematodirus that's infecting this year's lamb crop are actually from the eggs that passed out from last year's crop of lambs. They were cooled over winter. Then when the spring comes and the weather warms up, those eggs hatch. So what can happen is that when the weather conditions are favourable, you can get a mass synchronised hatching of nematodirus, and they're then available on the pasture to infect young and naive lambs. So when this large challenge coincides with the time when the lambs are beginning to consume significant amounts of grass, you can get a particularly severe disease that in severe cases can lead to lamb death or can cause serious damage to the gastrointestinal tract that'll prevent the lambs from thriving in the future. So because of this mass hatching phenomenon, when the weather conditions are right, it means that nematodirus can strike quite quickly and that farmers need to be very aware and to watch out for it.
And there's something you mentioned, like they're consuming the larvae on the pasture. When they consume it, it's actually damaging the gut. So that's one of them long-term carryover effects we see of this disease if it's not treated promptly.
Absolutely. So, this disease can cause quite severe damage to the intestinal mucosa, and you can get kind of protein loss, and this kind of damage can have a long-term impact on the lamb that will mean that it doesn't thrive well into the future, and they can be much slower to finish.
I suppose one thing about virus, and you said it's a carryover from the previous year, it's going to be present on practically every sheep farm. Distinguishing it from coccidiosis, which is also quite common, and we discussed in an earlier podcast, how do you differentiate the two?
Yeah, so that can be quite tricky. So, in terms of the signs of nematodirus in lambs, some of the signs will be the sudden onset of scarring, and you can get kind of fecal staining of the wool around the rear end. The lambs will be dull and depressed. They'll be dehydrated. You'll get weight loss. And you may see the lambs kind of gather around water troughs due to this dehydration, and the ewes will be they'll be unaffected. So obviously some of those symptoms can be very similar to coccidia, and it is very important to be aware of the risk from both types of parasites because they do strike at the same time and they can have some similar symptoms such as scarring. So quite often you're looking at things like the risk factors, previous history, if you've had outbreaks of either of them before, the grazing history, and then after that, really, you're looking at the first line treatment being to go in with something like a white dose for nematodirus. And then fairly quickly afterwards, if the symptoms don't improve, then it may be a case of going in and treating for coccidia.
Okay, so nematodirus first. So you touched on some of the diagnostics of it there, and you mentioned the forecast earlier. Knowing when to go in and when to treat for this, what's the best approach?
Yeah, so I suppose really, as I said, this can have quite a severe effect on the lamb. So really what you want to do is you want to prevent the disease occurring. So there's a couple of steps that you can take to do that. So as I mentioned earlier, where you get disease, this is where lambs are picking up larvae that have hatched from eggs that were passed out by last year's lambs. So one of the ways of preventing disease is to try and try and not have young lambs grazing on pasture that was grazed by lambs of a similar age from last year. So that would be one way to try and prevent it. The other is with the treatment, with anthelminthic treatment. Now, because we know the conditions required for nematodirus to hatch, that means we can predict when the hatching is going to occur. So the Department of Agriculture, they produce a nematodirus forecast, and this forecast will also give advice on when farmers should treat. So in the case of this year, they're saying that the peak hatch will be between about the 14th to the 21st of April. So that will depend. It'll be the earlier dates if you're on the southwest coast where the weather is a bit milder. It'll be the later dates for most of the rest of the country. So they will recommend that you treat about 2 weeks after the hatch. So that's about the third week of April for the southwest coasts, and then the last week of April or the first week of May for the rest of the country.
And that's information, we'll put that information ourselves, but it will also be carried in all the media outlets. Like the other diagnostic technique we talked about with parasites, more so later in the season, is using fecal egg counts. Now, traditionally, we never recommend fecal egg counts for identifying nematodirus early in the season. Maybe you'll just explain why.
Yes, so really for nematodirus, fecal egg counts can be of limited value. And the reason for this is that the disease is primarily caused by the larval stage of the parasite. So this is the immature parasite before it develops through to an adult stage that will lay eggs. So what can happen is if a lamb has a large number of infective larvae that are causing damage to the gut, they're not laying any eggs. So you could have a negative fecal egg count, but you could still have quite a severe infection. So for that reason, the use of fecal egg counts does have limited value, and things like clinical signs, risk factors, and the department forecast may be more useful in deciding what approach and what strategy to take.
Just in terms, like we talked about, the main strategy going to be employed on farms will be using anthelminthic products to dose. You mentioned white drench. Why specifically white drench over the others?
Yes, yeah. So we would recommend a benzimidazole, also known as a white wormer, and that's also generally mentioned in the forecast that comes out from the department. And the main reason for that is that while we know that resistance to the white wormers has been found on a number of farms for the mid-season stomach worms, so the stomach and gut worms later in the season, to date there's been no reports of white wormer resistance in nematodirus. So therefore what we want to do is we want to protect the other classes of wormers, the yellow wormers and the clear wormers. We want to protect them. We want to use them only when necessary. So we keep them for later in the season, and we use a white wormer to treat for nematodirus. So it's really important, particularly on farms that have had issues with white wormer resistance, that they continue to use a white wormer for nematodirus, and then they can keep the other classes of wormers for use later on in the season against the other stomach and gut worms.
And just think when you mention that, it also strikes me there is no residual activity with any of the products for nematodirus. So in certain cases,
no.
the need then for repeat treatment.
Absolutely. So there's no residual activity for any of the products against nematodirus. So it may be that lambs will need to be treated a second time. And there's a few different reasons as to why they might be treated a second time. So as you mentioned, one may be that they get reinfected. There's no residual activity, so they get reinfected. But also if you go in early and miss the hatch, that might be another reason why lambs might need a second treatment. And again, the risk factors are when the hatch coincides with the period of time when the lambs are eating significant amounts of grass. So particularly in groups, where you've lambs of mixed ages, it may be that at some times some are eating more grass than others. So there may be within that group, they may be at different risks at different times.
So a second dose, possibly 2 weeks later, might be one approach to reducing the risk of that further on. I'm just thinking,
yes.
as we progress later in the season, we tend to worry less about nematodirus. So that initial exposure, does the lamb build up immunity to that as the season progresses?
Yeah. So generally, by about when the lambs are 12 weeks of age, they have built up sufficient immunity to nematodirus that it's not an issue. The number of infective L3 on pasture will also be declining at this time. And in general, they don't need any treatment after about this age.
Okay. Orla, I think you've covered all aspects of it there. Thanks very much for taking the time to come in and join us and talk on this topic.
Thank you, Kieran.
We're going to wrap things up at this point. Again, nematodirus is a condition you need to be very vigilant for on farms at the moment. Orla highlighted some of the key signs we need to look out for, and to use the department forecast, as it does predict the peak hatch nematodirus, i.e. the peak challenge as well, in regions around the country. I'll include a link to that in the description. One key thing Orla did highlight, when treating for nematodirus, use products from group 1 benzimidazole, i.e. a white wormwood. The idea behind that is we preserve the other products for use later in the season. For any other updates on sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Chocolate Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks very much for joining us in this episode of OviCast. Again, don't forget to subscribe and tune in to future episodes.